cockpit of a flight here. To understand your who's the first pilot? Come funziona?
Concludiamo questa splendida mattinata qui in Querini Stampalia con i luoghi, non luoghi, che sono le mappe. Sarà estremamente interessante fare questo giro del mondo questa volta. Il nostro autore è inglese, ma appunto ci porterà in giro per il mondo e soprattutto attraverso le sue rappresentazioni. Sono molto contenta di questa presenza. Ci aiuteranno a appunto svolgere il tema di questo incontro la professoressa Marica Milanesi dell'Università di Pavia e il professor Giampiero Bellingeri dell'Università di Ca Foscari del Dipartimento di Studi sull'Asia e l'Africa Mediterranea. Grazie.
Hello. Before I start, I just want to say a few words about how amazed and moved I am to be here. If you work on the history of maps, then to be in Venice is very special, because obviously the contribution that the city makes to the whole history of mapping is extremely important. So thank you for having me. And particularly I want to thank Charles Bassi, who's here at the front. Charles' creative energy and ability to put this festival together always amazes me. I think he's a great figure that you have here in Venice, and I want to salute him for doing this. So, Charles, thank you. I'd just like to read from the book for about 5 minutes, and then we'll go into conversation. So, this book takes 12 maps from cultures and moments in world history and examines the creative processes through which they tried to resolve the problems faced by their makers, from perception and abstraction to scale, perspective, orientation, and projection. The problems are constant, but the responses are specific to the map maker's particular culture. And we discover that what drove them was as much personal, emotional, religious, political, and financial as geographical, technical, and mathematical. Each map either shaped people's attitudes to the worlds in which they lived or crystallized a particular worldview at specific moments in global history, often both. These 12 maps were created at particularly crucial moments when their makers took bold decisions about how and what to represent. In the process, they created new visions of the world that aimed not only to explain to their audiences that this was what the world looked like, but to convince them of why it existed and to show them their own place within it. Each map also encapsulates a particular idea or issue that both motivated its creation and captured its contemporaries' understanding of the world, from science, politics, religion and empire, to nationalism, trade and globalization. But maps are not always shaped exclusively by ideology, conscious or unconscious. Inchoate emotional forces have also played their part in making them. The examples here range from the pursuit of intellectual exchange in an Islamic map from the 12th century to global conceptions of toleration and equality in Arno Peters' controversial world map published in 1973. Although this book makes no claim to provide anything approaching a comprehensive story of the history of cartography, it does offer several challenges to prevailing assumptions about the subject. The first is that, however we interpret the history of maps, it is not an exclusively Western activity. Current research is revealing just how far pre-modern, non-Western cultures are part of the story, from the Babylonian world map to Indian, Chinese, and Muslim contributions. Secondly, there is also no hidden agenda of evolution or progress in the historical mapping of the world. The maps examined are the creation of cultures which perceive physical terrestrial space in different ways, and these perceptions inform the maps they make. This leads to the third argument, that each map is as comprehensible and as logical to their users as the other, be it the medieval Hereford Map or Google's geospatial applications. The story told here is therefore a discontinuous one, marked by breaks and sudden shifts, rather than the relentless accumulation of increasingly accurate geographical data. The map, whatever its medium or its message, is always a creative interpretation of the space it claims to represent. The critical deconstruction of maps as objective representations of reality by writers like Korzybski, Bateson and others has left them looking like malevolent tools of ideology, weaving a conspiratorial web of deceit and dissimulation wherever they are to be found. Instead, the maps in this book are interpreted more as a series of ingenious arguments, creative propositions, highly selective guides to the worlds they have created. Maps allow us to dream and fantasize about places we shall never see, either in this world or in other, as yet unknown worlds. Perhaps the best metaphorical description of maps was graffitied in 45-centimetre letters on a wall next to the railway station approaching Paddington Station in London. Far away is close at hand in images of elsewhere. A metaphor, like a map, involves carrying something across from one place to another. Maps are always images of elsewhere, imaginatively transporting their viewers to far away, unknown places, recreating distance in the palm of your hand. Consulting a world map ensures that far away is always close at hand. How valuable a good map is, wrote the 17th century painter Samuel van Hoogstraten, in a similar vein, wherein one views the map as from another world. Oscar Wilde developed Hoogstraten's transcendental sentiment when he famously remarked that a map of the world that does not include utopia is not even worth glancing at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing. And when humanity lands there, it looks out and, seeing a better country, sets sail. Maps always make choices about what they include and what they omit, but it is at the moment such decisions are made that wild dreams of the possibility of creating a different world, or even new worlds beyond our knowledge, which is one of the reasons that science fiction writers have been drawn irresistibly to maps. As Ortelius admitted, every map shows one thing, but therefore not another, and represents the world in one way, and as a consequence, not in another. Such decisions might often be political, but they are always creative. The ability expressed by all the map makers in this book to rise above the earth and look down on it from a distinctive perspective represents an idealistic leap of imaginative faith in humanity. But so powerful is this vision that various political ideologies have sought to appropriate it for their own ends.
Buongiorno, grazie. Eccoci qua. Siamo con Jerry Brotton e con un bel libro che ci fa viaggiare. Jerry Brotton è professore di Renaissance Studies alla Queen Mary di Londra, è storico della cultura, è autore di numerosi studi in cui la storia della cartografia anche compare, no? E poi collezioni d'arte rientrano nelle sue opere. E però oggi siamo qui a parlare di un numero magico e di una carta magica che è la mappa. Dovrei anche presentare una compagna che mi sostiene nella ricerca in questi momenti, in questi periodi, è la professoressa Marica Milanesi, già prof a Genova e a Pavia di storia della geografia, storia della cartografia, storia delle scoperte geografiche. Presentare me stesso è un po' patetico, mi chiedo perché io sia qui, ma quando il professor Shaul Bassi mi ha invitato a esserci, non ho saputo negargli la mia compagnia, ecco, e quindi è un'opera di condiscendenza che mi porta qui. In realtà qualche connection ce l'ho anch'io con la cartografia, perché in particolare in questi periodi stiamo studiando, Marica ed io, una mappa che comparirà forse alla fine se facciamo in tempo e se ci comportiamo bene. Do il benvenuto quindi al professor Brotton e gli farò subito per captatio benevolenza i complimenti per la sua maniera che ha di descrivere. La descrizione accurata di ogni mappa mi pare che ricordi quella dei bravi storici dell'arte che descrivono l'oggetto studiato o il soggetto studiato in modo molto raffinato e appunto complesso, articolatissimo. Già questa maniera di descrivere mi fa venire in mente di porgli una domanda che desumo dal suo libro. Il professor Brotton a un certo punto parla di una domanda che si ponevano i classici greci a proposito della cartografia. Ma insomma la cartografia è arte o scienza? La risposta forse ce l'ha da lui, professor Brotton. È arte o scienza la cartografia?
What's interesting is that cartography as a concept is only invented in the 19th century. So the German and French academic tradition says there is a whole problem with map making. We've never had an understanding of it as a discipline. And so in the early 19th century, the German tradition particularly starts to talk about the science of cartography. There is no such thing in the period before this. So it's a 19th century invention, the science of map making, cartography. Now, if you go right back, I guess, to the Greeks, and we can look at an image. Oh, here we go. No. We can see Ptolemy. So here you have, this is the Greek geographer Ptolemy from 150 AD. This is a later Byzantine copy of Ptolemy's world picture. But Ptolemy in 150 AD in Alexandria trying to create an image of the world which is both creative and scientific. There's an understanding in the Greek tradition that you are borrowing from a scientific tradition, from an understanding of how you measure the shape and the circumference of the world. but you're also drawing on travellers' stories, what the Greeks call akoe, hearsay, the stories that travellers bring back and say, I travelled to this place called India and it looks like this, but then they also had these strange creatures with very large heads and small feet and they ate each other. And you get these weird stories that come back in to Alexandria where Ptolemy is working. And so Ptolemy is trying to sift out that much more artistic literary tradition to create something that looks more objective and scientific. But always the maps are moving between both the science and the art. And it seems to me that this is a good example of that, that the power of a map is that the map is always an artistic representation of something that we regard as very scientific. And that is the power of the map. That's why we're so fascinated by the map. We don't take into account a scientific description of the shape and size of the world. We may read that if we're scientists and we can understand that, but it is the emotional power of that image of the whole Earth, which is, of course, an aesthetic issue as much as it's a scientific issue. And so now that we start to believe with Google and online maps that this is a purely scientific issue, I think that's an illusion. And it's an ideological illusion, of course, because companies like Google wish to tell us this is a purely objective and scientific representation. But still, if we look at that image by Google, I'd say to you it is a cleaned up, aestheticized image of the world, because where are the clouds? And again, you can make decisions about how you transform that map, because you can turn on or off those yellow political national boundaries. They are, of course, an illusion. There are no such thing as those boundaries. But you turn them on and off because it makes sense, it gives shape to the world as you understand it. But that's, of course, a selective decision you make, and it's also an artistic decision, as well as a political decision.
Grazie. Allora, insisto, professor Brotton, può darsi, prima di arrivare, cioè alle domande puntute di una storica della geografia, mi permetta di insistere. Può darsi che lei proceda a un'operazione mimetica, cioè tal quale la mappa spiega ogni mappa spiega a modo suo il mondo, così lei spiega la mappa e in questo modo si fa il racconto di un racconto di un racconto. È una sorta di ridondanza fra mitologia, che è il discorso, il raccontare, e il narrare della mappa, perché la mappa poi è anche enunciabile, no? Tant'è vero che lei ci dà 12 esempi di questi racconti che a sua volta ripropone a noi. Può darsi anche che per assecondare i consigli che ci davano i classici, parlare di mappe e tracciare mappe sia qualcosa di curativo, di terapeutico, e mi scusi se azzardo, dato che si parte misticamente dal presupposto che la nostra terra è falsa, sfalsata, è malata rispetto alla terra ideale, può darsi che ogni autore di mappe e ogni descrittore di mappe cerchi di aggiustare la terra, il mondo e anche se stesso insieme. Può essere questo un processo?
Yes, I think I agree with that completely, and it's what I was talking about in that extract, that the late 20th century tradition has been to turn our understanding of maps into malevolent tools of ideology. So we can all point to those maps from the First or the Second World War, the Cold War maps that you have of US and the Soviet Union creating each other as these big, terrible sort of political power blocks. And what happened, of course, in the 20th century, and Marica will know this, that geography became very much in thrall. It became drawn into the world of politics, because suddenly statesmen and military leaders wanted to use maps in a way that we'd never seen them used so powerfully before. And geography as a young discipline said, fantastic, we are now part of political decision making. But of course that process went too far because they just became embedded in very selective political forms of ideology. The response within academic studies was then to say, look at maps. Maps are tools of ideology, and we must therefore deconstruct them and unpick the evil messages that they portray. Well, that's fine. There's a certain tradition where it's important that one must do that and point out the selectiveness of all maps. But what I wanted to do with this book, and may I say I think it's one of the reasons that it's been received very well in Italy, is because I want to talk about that poetic tradition of a utopian possibility of a map, the way in which a map, as you were just describing, and all these maps are about transcendence. Any map maker is always undertaking an imaginative act of transcendence, that they are rising up above the earth and looking down on it, as this map shows you, even the Google map. It's putting you in a godlike perspective. It's saying you take a divine perspective, that you look back down onto the earth. And one of the stories I tell in the book is that the first time that that image of looking back down onto the earth is finally realized by man is in 1973, when the Apollo space mission takes a photograph of the whole Earth, and it's that famous image of what comes to be called the blue marble, the image of our world, Earth, Gaia, floating in this sea of black space, cold, terrible place, but this beautiful, beautiful object, Earth, that there it is. And in 1973, that image is beamed back and goes round the world. And of course, it transforms our understanding of environmental politics. And this Google image, of course, Google Earth, is deliberately playing on that whole Earth image from the 1973 Apollo Earth mission. Now, I make a joke in the book that I say, this image is finally the ultimate manifestation of geography. Geography has always wanted, as it were, to draw the Earth from deep space. And when it's finally achieved, it's by a photograph taken by an astronaut in 1973. So right back to Ptolemy, if we go back to that Ptolemy image, Ptolemy in 150 AD, transcending the world, trying to imagine what the world looks like from deep space. And this is what he's doing with these kind of images. Again, another Ptolemaic image. And so it's the power of that transcendence, the fact that we're not all here because we think that maps are malevolent tools of ideology. You're all here because maps allow us to wonder in awe at the earth, to think of different possibilities of what the world could be, better than it is at the moment. And that's a very powerful dimension, it seems to me, of the transcendental and the utopian possibilities of map making.
Grazie, ancora un piccolo atto di prepotenza da parte mia, e riguarda il linguaggio e l'esercizio d'equilibrio in questi momenti tragici in cui questo equilibrio sembra sfuggito. Cioè, prima cito un distico molto celebre per chi si occupa di letteratura persiana e turca, è un distico di Mevlana, sapete il fondatore di quella, chiamiamola quella corrente mistica, detta dei Mevlevi, dei dervisci rotanti, il distico che è l'incipit del suo divano, cioè del suo canzoniere, suona pressappoco così: ascolta il flauto di canna, ascolta il suo lagno, ascolta come si lamenta delle separazioni, perché vuole ricongiungersi al canneto. Il flauto ovviamente è ottenuto dall'incisione, dall'asportazione dal canneto di una canna che poi con dei fori praticati dà luogo al lamento della nostalgia. Questa canna ha una figura emblematica, potrebbe essere anche quella che raccoglie attorno a sé avvolta una mappa, e può darsi anche che tutte le mappe vogliano ricongiungersi nel sistema delle mappe del mondo, richiamandosi a vicenda, quindi superando anche la discontinuità di cui il professor Brotton parlava nella premessa, nella sua presentazione. Ecco, a proposito ancora di equilibrio di linguaggi, il suo sembra un libro che richiedeva la pratica di quale linguaggio? Della divulgazione o di quello dell'accademia? E in che modo è arrivato a dosarli bene questi due elementi?
I wrote it for my father-in-law. I wrote the book for my father-in-law because he was a man in his 70s, and he was always asking me the questions that all historians of cartography try and answer, but in very academic language. So he'd keep saying to me, what's the earliest map of the world from the Greeks? I'd say, Ptolemy. And he'd say, what are the Chinese doing at the same time? And I'd say, oh, well, the Chinese are doing this. And he'd say, what is the Islamic tradition? And I'd say, well, this is a map from Ptolemy in 150 AD. And then I'd say, and that's what happens in the Islamic tradition, which is a map from the 11th century. And he'd say, oh, this is fascinating. And so my attempt with the book was really picking up what you're asking about language. It was an attempt to tell a story that was drawing on academic work. I'd been working on maps since 1992. I did my PhD at London University on maps. And I'd carried on doing that work, but at this stage I wanted to write a book that was deeply informed by the academic scholarship. People like this incredibly eminent scholar of the history of mapmaking. Marica's work, you know, is embedded in this book. There is nothing academically innovative about this book. It's an act of synthesis. It's an attempt to give an overview, rather like the maps themselves, a sort of poetic overview of the history of maps. But to tell these kind of stories that, it seems to me, for a more informed general audience, are quite surprising. So we tend to usually think of the story of the history of cartography as a predominantly Western story. So I wanted to say, no, because this is Ptolemy, this is the 150 AD description of Ptolemy's world, and it looks to us, in terms of its centering on the Mediterranean, reasonably recognizable. You know, the Greeks don't have a concept of the Pacific, they don't have a concept of the Americas, they don't really have a concept of sub-Saharan Africa. So if you look at the map, it really gives you an image of the Indian Ocean, which is just a big lake, sort of like a car park, blue car park. And so the world ends in its easternmost point, somewhere around Korea. But so then I wanted to tell the story of the way in which the Islamic tradition, picking up on what you were just talking about, does something completely different. So you see the world here with the orientation is south at the top. So what you see in the bottom right-hand corner is Europe. The large blue squiggle that goes up and round is the Nile. So you're looking at, in effect, sub-Saharan Africa is at the top of this map. The reason this orientation is so is because it's a map which is effectively centered on the Arabian Peninsula and puts Mecca at the center of the world. So south is therefore at the top, with roughly the center being in Mecca. Now, of course, if you move forward another 200 years, this is a Christian world map. This is the Hereford Map Mundi, and this has east at the top. So if you look at the very top of the map, outside the frame of the map, is a picture of Christ leading people one way to heaven and the other way to hell. And the center of this map, the dead center of the map, is Jerusalem. And again, shows a theology. It's a theology of geography, which shows Christ crucified in Jerusalem. So you can see again that these are selective maps which choose to put south at the top in an Islamic tradition, these two maps. This is Idrisi from 1154. Again, same image. If you look at those two, quite similar. And then you look at the Hereford map, and it turns the map again 90 degrees and puts east at the top. And what's then interesting is that this is a Korean map from 1402. And this puts north at the top, and we're familiar with north. This seems actually strangely recognizable to us. But the reason that the Korean and the Chinese tradition puts north at the top is that everybody looks up to the emperor in a position of subjection. They look up north. the emperor looks down south. That's always the position from which you understand your relationship to the emperor. And I love this map because if you see in the far left-hand corner, it shows you Africa, and in the top left-hand corner, it shows you the Mediterranean. So this is what the world looks like if you're in China or Korea in the early 15th century. And then the Chinese do maps like this. So the attempt was really to write a book where the language was really speaking to a much more broader audience. To say, let us tell a story about cartography, not just a history, and one which is as interested in talking about how poets and novelists think about maps. I mean, the great book to be written, of course, is the way in which the history of literature is so fascinated by maps, because a map does something very similar. You know, it creates an imagined world. So we have Lewis Carroll, Georges-Louis Borges, and where do you want to end with the number of writers who talk about maps? Calvino. I mean, Italo Calvino was a huge inspiration for me in terms of writing this book. I work in literature. I teach literature. I'm not a geographer. I'm not a scientist. I'm somebody who believes in the poetry of geography. So that question about language is for me very important.
Bene, ringraziamo il suocero. Mi sembra molto carino da parte sua aver provocato. La scrittura di un libro di queste dimensioni deve avere un'autorità straordinaria in famiglia, questo suocero, per produrre 500 pagine. Complimenti. Dunque, adesso qualche domanda da parte mia. Puntuta non credo, Giampiero esagera sempre un po' in queste cose, ma qualche domanda, qualche interrogativo, qualche dubbio e anche qualche opinione non del tutto coincidente con la tua ce l'ho. Prima cosa, comunque ti vorrei chiedere, visto che il libro è complesso, desta molta curiosità e molti interrogativi, a cominciare, non dal titolo, il 12 numero magico va benissimo per tutti, ce l'abbiamo in tante culture, noi, voi. Ma ecco, per esempio, il volume è fatto, le carte sono descritte in ordine cronologico, però l'ordine cronologico non è in accordo con i titoli dei capitoli, per esempio. I titoli dei capitoli non parlano di storia, ma parlano di metodi, di idee, di categorie dello spirito, di strutture politiche, di tolleranza, di impero, di denaro, nazione, eccetera. Tutte queste cose, naturalmente solo in qualche caso, sono esclusive dell'epoca e della carta presa in considerazione. Allora, magari volevo chiederti che criteri hai usato per scegliere le carte e in particolare proprio le singole carte, perché non una e non l'altra, mettiamola così, e anche se in generale se ci dici come hai progettato questo volume, perché altre cose che tu hai scritto fanno uso appunto della storia di un genere o di qualche cosa, anche di qualche oggetto, la collezione di Carlo II per esempio, per raccontare la storia, ne fai le protagoniste della storia. Volevo chiederti appunto il progetto di base di questa opera, che poi si compone naturalmente della descrizione di una serie di carte, come hai detto adesso. Grazie.
Thank you, because it's an important question, because I had done a book before this which was about the history of Charles I's art collection, which was to tell a story. Well, actually, I always considered it a biography. It was a biography of an art collection. So that was the person, as it were, to say what happens to the movement of that collection of objects, but to treat the object almost as a person, to say how does it move, what happens when it gets lost, what happens when it comes back together. And so this was a story about an art collection. And the map is also something which is both an object and a subject. It comes back to what Giampiero was saying. It has this strange status. Is it about space? Is it about time? Is it about art? Is it about science? Is it graphic in terms of, is it written? Or is it graphic because it's a visual representation? This, it seems to me, is why the map is always endlessly fascinating, because it always crosses these areas. the issue about the 12 maps and why I chose 12, I'm laughing because I'm being very confessional about my stepfather, and I was having children when the book was being written, and I was way behind, and I pleaded with my editor. I said, I know we've agreed to 12, but I'm really, really behind. Can we cut it back to 10? And he said, no, no, you can't. The 12 was a good number, it seemed to me, because it allowed me to talk about very obvious maps, that if you're talking about the history of cartography, you have to talk about figures like Mercator. Mercator is the great 16th century Renaissance mapmaker. The Mercator projection is so significant in the history of maps and geography. I had to write about Mercator. I had to, I think, write about Ptolemy. We had to have Ptolemy. But also I wanted to, as I've been suggesting, tell a story about the more global dimension of maps, where you have these sorts of maps which are not usually taken into account. An Islamic tradition, a Korean tradition, a Chinese tradition. This is a Chinese map from 1136. So I wanted to be able to tell the story that was more inclusive. So you get a mix of the two, which is really what drove those decisions and selections. But I also know, as I think lies behind your question, that there are controversies about that. It depends on other people's views. They may disagree with the significance of choosing, I don't know, the Waldseemüller map. This is the Martin Waldseemüller 1507 map that is the first representation of America. It's the first map to show the Pacific and to show America in the bottom left-hand corner and to label it America. Again, this seemed to me a very, very significant map to use. So it was a mixture of both what's familiar and also what is unfamiliar. And I did want to insist on keeping that metaphor of the story rather than just history going. I wanted to tell a story that made connections that people are not familiar with. So how does the Islamic tradition develop through the Roman and the Greek tradition? And how is there a moment of connection? So this Idrisi map, Al-Idrisi, was a Muslim mapmaker working in Sicily in 1154 for a Norman king, Roger II, producing a map which is deeply influenced by Islamic traditions, but for a Norman king in Sicily. And so it's a moment, I guess, of what academics would call convivenza. It's a moment of the meeting of these different traditions of Greek, Roman, but also Islamic and Latin traditions coming together and being fused. So I wanted to keep that story open to say this is not just a story of the exclusive triumph of the West. It's a story which has always been mixed.
Grazie. Posso fare un'altra domanda? Dunque, o meglio, un'osservazione su quello che hai detto adesso. Naturalmente hai scelto quello che ti pareva, per carità, ma volevo chiederti, come mai niente carte marine? O meglio, non carte marine medievali? Dopotutto c'è una carta marina del mondo, che è l'Atlante catalano, che, voglio dire, ha qualche elemento di innovazione. No, te lo chiedo non perché io sia una partigiana delle carte nautiche, oddio lo sono anche, ma è perché tu fai un discorso molto rigido, secondo me, tra un'opposizione molto rigida tra Medioevo e modernità, tra religioso e secolare in particolare, che è una cosa che non sono solo io naturalmente a dirti, perché altri ne hanno parlato naturalmente. Ecco, per esempio il caso dell'Atlante catalano è quello di una carta del mondo della fine del 300, ma con un modello di inizio 300, quindi di pochi decenni posteriori alla mappa mondi di Hereford, che tu hai scelto invece come modello della carta teologica, e accidenti è fatta da preti, voglio dire, non c'è modo per non esserlo, oltre al fatto che illustra la storia del mondo, la storia sacra, la storia profana e quant'altro, oltre alla geografia, quindi deve contenere molto di religioso. Comunque, e dicevo, l'Atlante catalano è una carta quasi coeva di quella, e del resto ce n'erano anche prima di carte marine, anche se non ci sono arrivate, addirittura all'epoca di Idrisi ce n'erano già, pare, secondo Cotier d'Alcher. Ebbene, lì l'aspetto religioso proprio non c'è. Allora forse mi sembra che una puntata anche nella parte più laica, diciamo, del Medioevo sarebbe stata opportuna all'interno di un discorso di storia della cartografia. Se invece il tuo intento era, come hai fatto con la collezione del re, di fare della storia attraverso le carte, allora hai scelto gli argomenti, degli ottimi argomenti, voglio dire. Però forse c'è un pochino di confusione tra, come dicevo prima, tra la struttura cronologica e la struttura tematica del tuo discorso, mi sembra.
Yeah, fortunately I got to write a book after this called Great Maps, which has 65 maps, and the Catalan Atlas is in there. So that's a slightly silly answer, but what I try to do with all 12 of the stories is to fold in the arguments that you've just been talking about. So I try to unravel, as it were, some of the maps. So the Waldseemüller map is a map which is very much based on those marine maps, what we call the Portolan charts, the charts that we used for navigation in places like the Mediterranean. So you start to see a combination of the maps, which is quite significant. You look at this map and it still has some traces of the medieval theological aspect that you have in the Mappa Mundi. So this map, looking at it, although it's expanding the shape of the world, Jerusalem is still effectively at the center of this map, but it is still drawing on the tradition of marine cartography and of Portolan charts. But as you see with this map, it's almost stretching the bounds of what geographical knowledge knows at this time. Look at Southern Africa on this map. It breaks the boundary. And it's almost as though this is a period where the map maker is desperately trying to keep up with new discoveries. And I suspect that he says to the printer, here's my map. And then he says, oh, hang on, we've just discovered the Cape of Good Hope. Can you change it quickly? And he goes, oh, no, I can't. Oh, well, just change. And this is an extraordinary map. And he says, we don't know much about what's in the middle. He says, okay, just put an elephant there. And Jonathan Swift says this later. He says, you know, map makers put in elephants for want of towns. Just put an elephant in the middle of there. And then somebody says, oh, we've just discovered America. And he goes, oh, no. So I think you're right, that there are moves I'm making which are too quick. And in a sense, you know this, that our field within the history of cartography is very, very academic. And I just wanted to do something that opened that up a little bit more and drew on a lot of criticism, but said, let's just begin to sort of tell stories that I hope will open up other stories. So you and I were talking about this, that now the Islamic tradition is something that people are studying much more than they have ever done before. It's becoming part of the story of the history of cartography. And historians of cartography are now doing this, and I'm part of doing that in my academic job, but I also then want to speak to a wider audience. So I'm very conscious that you play a dangerous game when you try and straddle the academy and the commercial world of popular books. It's a difficult place to be, but it's quite a nice place to be because you come and do events like this and meet people like you, so it's nice.
Bene, grazie. Un'altra domanda. Un'altra domanda che è un po' connessa con questa, ma scusami, è il mio mestiere. Alla poesia provvede lui, ma io mi occupo di cose più banali. Sempre riguardante il contenuto di questo tipo di opere, che sì, in effetti sono molto più difficili da scrivere di qualunque opera accademica. L'opera accademica sai esattamente che linguaggio devi usare, a chi ti rivolgi, che parametri devi seguire, eccetera. Qua no, qua inventi in realtà un genere che forse, sicuramente nel paese da cui tu vieni è molto più diffuso che qui. Qui è difficilissimo, in effetti è molto poco praticato e non così bene come si fa in Inghilterra. Comunque, e poi naturalmente c'è una cosa da tenere in considerazione, che per scrivere un'opera di sintesi e soprattutto in situazioni in cui tutti i giorni praticamente qualcosa di nuovo, di diverso viene scritto su certi argomenti, nella fattispecie la storia delle carte, richiede molto coraggio e anche dei rischi, pone dei rischi, perché capita a volte che si presentino come dati di fatto, acquisiti delle opinioni che sono diffuse ma non necessariamente condivise da tutti, o che semplicemente nel frattempo, nel giro di quei 2 anni che sono passati dalla tua pubblicazione, qualche altra cosa di eventualmente rilevante sia stato scritto su un argomento che tu tratti, considerandolo tutto sommato esaurito da un punto di vista della ricerca accademica, quindi disponibile per una offerta al pubblico in un linguaggio comprensibile, attraente, eccetera. Ti dico questo perché Mercatore, visto che è una delle carte obbligate che tu hai dovuto studiare, ovviamente lo era, per esempio, secondo me oggi non è, o forse non lo era nemmeno ieri, non lo so, completamente definibile nei termini in cui lo descrivi e lo definisci tu. Non parlo della proiezione, per carità, che hai trattato in realtà con molta intelligenza e con molto intuito anche sugli aspetti meno pratici e meno scientifici della proiezione stessa, cioè su questo aspetto semmai di quasi una navigazione ideale sui mari del mondo in pace, del mondo di Dio, no? E questa mi è sembrata un'osservazione estremamente interessante su questa carta, di solito trattata esclusivamente in termini matematici. Però ci sono altri aspetti dell'opera di Mercatore su cui io non sarei tanto d'accordo, proprio perché secondo me alcune acquisizioni sono state fatte su di lui, in questo senso. Ti cito soltanto quello che tu affermi, cioè che, e direi quasi per scontato, che Mercatore esclude Tolomeo dalle carte geografiche. Ora, a me non sembra proprio, mi sembra che al contrario, e come pensano del resto i suoi contemporanei, come Filippo Sassetti per esempio, che Mercatore faccia di tutto per salvare Tolomeo e che i limiti alla sua conoscenza del mondo, non sono della sua conoscenza del mondo secondo Mercatore, non siano limitazioni, come traduce il tuo traduttore, come forse hai scritto tu, scusami, non ho letto l'originale, ma siano i confini del mondo. Tolomeo, per Mercatore, occupa tutti i confini del mondo antico, solo l'America gli è ignota. Tanto è vero che nella sua identificazione dei luoghi tolemaici all'estremità del mondo, in Asia in particolare, Mercatore dà per scontato che Tolomeo conosca la Cina. Il Gange indiano, dice Mercatore, non è il vero Gange di Tolomeo, ma è il fiume di Canton, il vero Gange di Tolomeo. L'Aurea Chersoneso è il Giappone, il Sinus Magnus è il Mar Cinese settentrionale e Cattigara si trova in Tartaria, cioè il confine orientale del mondo, secondo Tolomeo, si trova in Tartaria a 58 gradi nord. Ecco, scuso l'aspetto pedante di questa osservazione, però mi sembra che questo sia uno dei problemi che scrivere un'opera come la tua comporti, per questo volevo presentartela con questo aspetto particolare e chiederti cosa ne pensi, se ovviamente l'avrai presa in considerazione prima di scrivere.
So now we get very technical. But in the book, I never try and make an argument that Mercator has walked away from Ptolemy. So as we know, Ptolemy is still being translated by map makers who know that his geography is completely wrong. Mercator's doing it himself in the later stages of his career. He's producing a version of Ptolemy's geography, effectively. He's using those maps. But this is what we now know, that the period is still completely obsessed by Ptolemy, even though the geography is wrong. So we look at this map and we know that Mercator is still using Ptolemy, although he knows that Ptolemy has no conception of half this map. So the map has the Americas, it's the whole of the left-hand side of this map. They're not in Ptolemy. He has no conception of the southern half of Africa, and he has very little conception of the Far East. However, you're absolutely right. Of course, Mercator he's completely wedded to the tradition of Ptolemy. And what he's doing is gradually using the frame of Ptolemy, and he's adding and adding and adding. And we know that there's a tipping point in the 17th century where Ptolemy becomes simply historical geography, and that has been superseded. Now, in 1569, when Mercator produces this map, that's not the case. And I never suggested that in the book. My point was to try and keep alive an understanding of the fact that Mercator looks two ways. He's still strongly invested in a medieval and a classical tradition, but he's also working through certain navigational aspects which are embedded in this map. As you say, the map is called a world map for use in navigation. It's to navigate from east to west. But again, the point I make in the book is if you look in the bottom left-hand corner of this map, you can see that the projection, because it shows the north and south poles stretched to infinity, in the bottom left-hand corner, he puts an inset map of the North Pole. That text tells us that Mercator is drawing on medieval traditions, and he says, I believe that the North Pole is created with 4 magnetic islands that surround an inflowing sea, and that the earth is therefore hollow, and that there are small pygmies called Skraelings who live on those 4 islands. Okay. Yeah, so we know that that's part of a medieval tradition, so I don't want to just say Mercator is the great harbinger, the great bringer of modernity, and he completely casts aside a medieval and a classical tradition. That's not the case. But he is a point where that projection is developed. And we know, you know, that the projection is not really used until the later 17th century, because nobody knows how he's done it. He's completely refused to tell people the maths of it. So the map is a complete aberration in many respects. And I agree with what you're saying. There's a huge problem as contemporary historians or scholars who look back and say, aha, this moment defines a decisive break. And I didn't want to really say that, but we have to take into account that the history of cartography always looks at Mercator in that way. But I tried to start the section of the book by pointing out this is a man who very few historians of cartography want to talk about, the fact that he was arrested for heresy in 1554. The Catholic Spanish authorities in the Low Countries arrest him on a charge of Lutheranism. They think he's a reformed Protestant. I'm interested in how that might work into this map as somebody who is theologically a very, very complicated figure. And then he produces a world map like this. I believe, again, it's a map, actually, which does go back to the classical past, because I think it's a map about Stoicism. It's a transcendental image of rising above the earth and trying to rise up above the sectarian, religious and political conflicts of late 16th century Europe. This is a map which often scholars say is a dreadful Eurocentric map, which shows Europe at the center of the world, and it's going to be used to colonize the rest of the world. Well, in the 1560s and 1570s, Europe is on fire. You know, this is a world which is being ripped apart by theological strife. Mercator's map shows nothing of that. It shows a beautiful image of the world with no boundaries, and I believe that he's tried to withdraw from the sectarian politics of the period to try and create another transcendental image, as we were talking about earlier, a possible world, and this is what it might look like. So in a way, I agree and I completely accept the criticisms. But in a sense, I'd like to go beyond that. One final thing. One of my great heroes intellectually is Edward Said, the Palestinian critic Edward Said. He wrote a book called Orientalism in 1978. In the last 20 years, that book has been absolutely taken apart and destroyed. And I'm not in any way, I don't wish to even believe I could match Said's brilliance. He was an extraordinary scholar of intellectual magnitude and political commitment. But basically, a whole tradition has now rubbished that book. And I think if only I had the possibility to write a book that changed everything as Said's Orientalism did. So sorry, can I just insist on this? This is a point about, you know, the way in which one can use academic work, I think, to cross over. I don't think this book is going to change everybody's lives, but I think there's a need in academic life to have a wider crossover. It's why we do events like this, and it's why we have these conversations. And somebody might say, no, you didn't quite get that right, and I say, fine, absolutely, I hold my hand up. I'm not a politician who wants to say everything's right. So, but this is a very important dialogue, as the dialogue is at these kind of events. And I want to insist on that. If we don't want academia to just die on its feet, it has to be something that reaches out at various points. So that's what we try and do just a little bit.
Professor Brotton, seguiamo il pendolo e approfitto della citazione della necessità della poesia che lei ha fatto qualche tempo fa e mi ricollego a pagina 64 del suo libro in italiano, dove lei scrive una cosa molto tenera per me e carica di suggestioni. Tolomeo, scrive lei, credeva nell'affinità delle stelle con il genere umano e nel fatto che le nostre anime sono una parte del cielo. Ok, molto bello, ma adesso io mi permetto di passare dal mondo tardo antico precipitosamente verso un'attualità un po' in via di... ma tutto scorre un po' in via di passaggio. Esiste, come tutti sappiamo, un poeta che si rifugia dalla Turchia a Mosca. Si chiama Nazım Hikmet ed è considerabile ancora il massimo poeta turco. A Mosca viene incaricato di scrivere un'operetta per i bambini che dovrebbero recitare. Lui scrive in turco, ma poi sarebbe stato tradotto in russo. Dovrebbero recitare una sorta di cantilena, però assai pregnante sul mondo e sulla chimica del mondo, sulla chimica sentimentale del mondo. E la sua poesia suona pressappoco così nella mia traduzione. Immaginiamo dei bambini sulla scena. Noi siamo il mondo, una stella fra le stelle, una gocciola siamo che scorre e che muta infinita, il che induce a complicarci la vita, perché noi consideriamo Hikmet marxista al 100%, come si dice a Milano dalla Milanesi, ma poi però sappiamo che il nonno di Nazım Hikmet era governatore di Aleppo, ma prima ancora governatore di Salonicco, e che da bambino Hikmet veniva accompagnato dal nonno, seguendo sentieri illuminati da ceri, sentieri mistici proprio, alle riunioni dei Mevlevi. E dunque abbiamo un rapporto tra il tardo antico neoplatonico e l'ambiente moscovita che nel 63, alla vigilia della morte di Hikmet laggiù, non era dei più aperti quanto a slanci mistici. Tuttavia mi faceva piacere confortare lei, come se lei avesse bisogno di questa visione hikmetiana, pressoché ignota, perché è inedito, l'operetta inedita finisce lì, finisce proprio con la sua morte. Ecco, poi questo ancora mi porta a stabilire rapporti allora, tra Tolomeo, Al-Idrisi, anche i Cassini. Abbiamo cioè un processo continuo di scorrere, dello scorrere, ed è quello che dice una gocciola siamo che scorre, che muta infinita, tal quale ebbe lei a definire la trasmissione della grafica delle mappe. Anzi, mi ven voglia di dire con una battuta facile in italiano, un gioco tra parole in italiano, meno facile credo in inglese. Si tratta di usare traslato un termine grammaticale o sintattico. In fondo la cartografia è una parte del discorso, la chiamerei, per ragioni anche fisiche, la chiamerei un inciso nel discorso, un inciso, un'incisione, quindi ecco. Lei accetterebbe questo accostamento tra parte del discorso, inciso, incisione, cioè tutta una contestualizzazione? L'accetterebbe, sì? Grazie. E poi, prego.
Yes, yeah, I would, and I think that what you're describing is something that I wanted to try and explore a little bit in the book, which is commonality of traditions, say across an Islamic Sufi tradition of the idea of transcendence, that you also get through the Neoplatonic tradition. And that seems to come through the tradition of Ptolemy, and is in all these maps that I'm talking about from the Western tradition. But you talk about a drop in the ocean. So I want to just show you something. I'd like to have called this talk maybe History of the World in 12.5 maps. So this is my half map, and this is, as it were, my Neoplatonic project, which is to work with the Fondazione Querini. And I see this as a utopian Neoplatonic issue, which is to create a world map without water on the Querini, on San Giorgio Maggiore, which would look like this. These are visualizations that I'm working with a friend of mine called Adam Lowe. Adam Lowe works with Factum Arte. Many of you will know the work because he created the facsimile of Veronese's Wedding at Cana, which is now back in the refectory. And when he made the work, I remember saying to him, "You're crazy to do a copy of the Veronese and put it back in the refectory. The Italians will kill you." And of course what happened, it was an enormous triumph, and people wept and said the Veronese had returned. Very, very powerful moment. So we now propose to the Querini that this is the next project that we want to do. I've worked with the Querini and done various exhibitions there, like Penelope's Labour, which was at the Biennale in 2011, 2012. So this is the project that we want to do, and I see it as a utopian project and a Neoplatonic project which will probably never be created. However, this is the project, see if you like it. So we create, using three-dimensional technology, we create a map of the world in 3 dimensions, in relief, without water. And you look at it here, and just to then, we talk about language, let me put some language on it, same image. So you're looking up from Brazil, and this is what the Atlantic looks like if you take the water away. And the world, suddenly, the global world that we live in, starts to look very, very different to us. So all these spikes that you see, and in the bottom right-hand corner are the Falklands. And Pasquale Gagliardi, who's the director of the Querini Foundation, said, "The only thing about this that slightly worries me is that if we make this and somebody falls over into the map and impales themselves on Las Malvinas, what do we do?" I mean, this would be terrible, Pasquale, this would be terrible. So this is, again, visualizations of what it would look like. And then this, in place, is the map that we would then flood the world. We would take water from the lagoon and we would flood the map. And we would flood it over a long period of time. I see this as an art installation. It's back to Giampiero's question. Is this a map? Is this a poetic statement? Is it a piece of science? What is it? Made by a crazy artist and a crazy Englishman in Venice, in a city that is drowning. Sorry, no. Oh. There you are! He's drowned. That was an accident.
Was it on purpose?
No, it's a complete accident. It should have been a picture of my children. But what's interesting about this is, again, it's the political problem of doing this kind of project is very, very difficult. So it seems to me, again, a truly utopian project. I think it will never be conceived because the politics and the finance of doing this, and may I speak out of turn, but when we presented this as a project several years ago, and your dear mayor was in attendance, and we said, well, we think this is a powerful statement of Venice in peril, he said, there's no problems with Venice and water. It's fine. And I remember being really shocked because I realized that the power of the map made such a powerful political and environmental statement, but it meant at this point in time it couldn't be created. Is that?
It is map.
Oh, what's Tommy got? I can't see it.
Map of Venice in place of. It's in the program book.
Tommy Ringer is just showing, I told them to put that on.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but this proves everything you say. There are these authors from all over the world coming to Venice who's in the middle as Jerusalem. See, it's in the program book, look at it. It's a very interesting projection.
Yeah, and it's the iconic power of that sort of image that depends on where you are, that can create that circular image which puts the world at the centre. And that's really all the 12 maps I show do that. They all put themselves, as it were, at the centre. It's what I call in the book egocentric mapping. You always want to put yourself and your ego at the centre. What's the first thing that everybody does when they go online and use Google Maps? They put in their home address. So they centre the world on themselves. And that's what the Hereford Map is doing in 1300. It's what Mercator's doing. It's what all these map makers always do. The Venetians among you will see that what that world map that I'm proposing is very much based on is, of course, Jacopo de Barbari's famous map of Venice from 1500. That's the great iconic image of maps that we take from that project. So that's my 12 and a half maps, and that is my Neoplatonic utopian map, which will probably never be made. But
grazie. Se c'è spazio per un'altra mezza mappa, proporrei una citazione utilizzabile eventualmente. Cito direttamente: nella parte inferiore della scala sulla destra vidi una piccola sfera cangiante di quasi intollerabile fulgore. Dapprima credetti ruotasse, poi compresi che quel movimento era un'illusione prodotta dai vertiginosi spettacoli che essa richiudeva. Il diametro dell'Aleph sarà stato di 2 o 3 centimetri, ma lo spazio cosmico vi era contenuto senza che la vastità ne soffrisse. È l'Aleph di Borges, che potrebbe stare bene come mappa. Ancora adesso spiegherei la ragione per cui siamo insieme tutte e tre e siamo quasi tutte e tre cartografi, o quasi cartografi tutte e tre. Abbiamo 2 minuti? Prego di mandare, se si può, la marciana filigrana alla regia, come usa dirsi. Eccola qua. Qui abbiamo la ragione per cui potremmo essere compatibili. È un mappamondo, come vedete, a forma di cuore, è datato 1559, ma c'è la data anche islamica. L'autore dice di chiamarsi Kaji Ahmed e vi dico che cosa dice di se stesso, e prego la signora traduttrice di aver pazienza. Qui nell'epilogo alla fine chiude così: nel nome di Dio, il clemente, il pietoso, elargitore del compenso di savi e sapienti, che il Signore voglia conceder loro la sua benedizione. Sappiate dunque che io, povero, meschino, impotente, indigente, e la divina misericordia voglia accompagnarmi amica, io, Haji Ahmed della città di Tunisi, fin dall'infanzia ho seguito i corsi di studio nella scuola Medrese della città di Fes in Marocco. Per un lungo lasso di tempo e per la maggior parte della mia vita, nell'ardore e con impegno fervente, ho perseguito con la mente e con il cuore la meta della vera, più intima e mistica conoscenza nello slancio verso il raggiungimento del massimo e più onorevole grado. Se non che, dopo aver acquisito la cultura a cui ambivo, per il volgersi e sfogliarsi tumultuoso delle pagine incise dal destino, caddi prigioniero nel mondo dei Franchi. Fui quindi comprato da un signore di là, e poi continua, fui trattato molto bene, e io, combinando la scienza di Tolomeo, la scienza accumulata, la scienza geografica accumulata dai musulmani e la scienza nuova che venivo acquisendo dagli infedeli franchi, ho prodotto quest'opera e Dio mi perdoni se ci sono degli errori, perché solo Lui è perfetto. Io volevo dedicare a voi e al professor Brotton, viene a chiamarlo Jerry, questo pezzo perché ricorda abbastanza bene la situazione in cui venne a trovarsi in Sicilia all'Idrissi, presso un sovrano ruggero cristiano, e però collaborando con geografi greci, arabi o musulmani, insomma, e così, ed ebrei, in un'apertura che sembra chiusa per sempre, diremmo adesso noi. In realtà sotto il manto di Kaji Ahmed, ve lo dico, si nascondono 4-5 grandi intellettuali veneziani che hanno prodotto questa mappa al fine di venderla, di metterla sulla piazza ottomana. Mi pare una maniera bella di dire grazie al professor Brotton e di non dimenticarsi di noi.
No, non ci sono domande. No, scusa. No, mi scusi, non sono previste domande. Volevo ringraziare a nome dell'Università gli organizzatori di Pia Masiero, Jerry Brotton per questa bellissima conversazione e i suoi intervistatori. Approfitto anche, visto che è stata chiamata in causa, di ringraziare la traduttrice simultanea e Pars Pro Toto, tutte le traduttrici e traduttori che ci aiutano così con così tanta competenza. Jerry Brotton è a disposizione per i firmacopie qui fuori. Thank you very much indeed.
Grazie.